Remember Crowsworn? Yeah, big hype Kickstarter and mid-tier controversy in the Hollow Knight community. Want to hear something crazy? That was all the way back in 2021. And we had already been starved of Silksong news even then. Whatever happened to all that time between then and now? And what even happened to that supposed rip-off of Hollow Knight? Well, for starters, their Kickstarter raised over $1 million United States rupees. And this is an important factor to note, especially in terms of release date. You see, when the Kickstarter launched, Mongoose Rodeo had to give a guesstimate release date so that people can factor that into their investment. Or to, help prove that it's all not just some big scam. That release date was December of 2023. The game had a decent development roadmap, I'm sure, and that might even have been a practical date to go for. But then Crowsworn got bank. So let's put that in perspective, alright? So, you start working on a game which has similarities to Hollow Knight that are in fact intentional. The best games always seem to be ones that take inspiration from many other games, blah 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 blah, generally using a major one as a template, in this case the #1 metroidvania, Hollow Knight. Then, changing the themes, Bloodborne, adding in different mechanics, Devil May Cry, and making a Mario Kart side project to attract the Nintendo nerds. Hollow Knight in general has had a strange effect on people. It's almost more rare to not see Hollow Knight ripoff thrown at any new Metroidvania revealed. The fandom has this strange, must-defend, throw oneself on a sword for Hollow Knight fetish that is extremely insulting to other talented devs and the projects they are working on. That's not to say we haven't seen actual full-on Hollow Knight ripoffs, or games inspired by Hollow Knight that might end up being utter trash to actually play. And I will be the first to admit, I might be the polar opposite of all of this, giving the benefit of the doubt to anything that seems similar to my favorite game of all time. Cause I want more of it. But regardless, the Hollow Knight community made an extra loud protest against Crowsworn, because not only did it have a hand-drawn art, Metroidvania design, and god forbid, a Pogo mechanic, but Crowsworn made the #1 sin you can make as an upcoming game. Crowsworn looked awesome. And when your game looks awesome, that can only mean one thing to the toxic side of a gaming fandom: competition. However, while this rather annoying group of individuals cried and wept and coped about the humanitarian crisis Crowsworn represented, the rest of us were busy simping the ever-living out of Mongoose Rodeo and showering them in that golden Geo sauce. Needless to say, the Crowsworn team did not expect to get anywhere close to $1 million frickin' dollars. Hollow Knight itself was made on a Kickstarter budget of only around $30,000 to $40,000 United States dollars and a box of croissants. Croissant! And while the super successful AAA games of today's world might require more than that to even get an alpha version out, bugs and all, for an indie developer making a Metroidvania, $1 million is a lot of frickin' dough. So when they wrote down the release date of late 2023, you can be sure they were not expecting to have $1 million worth of development left to do. Because the reality is, while that amount of money is liberating, it's also super dangerous. The amount of pressure on the team now to deliver what they themselves would deem $1 million credits worthy must be so high, and to be honest, way higher than even most of us fans would expect. But in the grand scheme of things, fans of the game like myself don't really matter in this certain case. Sure, take your time, make a good game, sure, we can wait, no pressure. The problem is all of these rip-off people. All the people just hoping that the game will fail to meet expectations. The extremely high budget is both a blessing and a curse. And yeah, that can come across as a bit of a privileged take too, like I would gladly take the $1 million instantly, as most any indie dev or person would. Like I said, I'm sure Mongoose Rodeo isn't in their dev nest in literal tears. Like yeah, the $1 million is awesome, all I'm saying is now the game has a much higher budget to live up to. I've covered most of the updates and new trailers we've gotten from Crowsworn since the release of the game on this channel. And if you didn't know, there was an anniversary trailer, a boss demo, they post regularly on Twitter, you should check it all out. But here recently we got a few updates and I want to focus in on the main takeaway that most interests me in these types of games. So in the most recent update, we got a bunch of interesting details, and there were a few that stood out to me. First off, right at the beginning there is a line of note. It's no secret that Crowsworn is going to cast a ridiculous number of boss battles. Most of them are optional, but nonetheless they're there for you to enjoy or hate. way back at the time of the Kickstarter, I remember during an interview, Alex, the lead dev, was asked how many boss fights would be in the game, and he said around 30 were planned at that point. Yeah, it isn't really a surprise that Crowsworn is attempting to give the player as many interesting fights as possible. What is noteworthy is how most of these boss fights will be optional. Most games go out of their way to make sure you can see as much content as possible. Even when it's optional stuff, you get hinted or directed to it. And this is generally because of the fear of missing out that a lot of gamers experience. See the Dark Souls games, there's generally a high number of boss fights, but most of the time, 90% of them are not optional. However, the wording that most of the boss fights are optional suggests that the main storyline of Crowsworn will be rather short and probably the easiest content of the game. This makes sense for a game inspired by Hollow Knight. While the map is huge and there's a ton of stuff to find, fight, and explore, if you mainline the story of Hollow Knight, it's actually pretty short and easy, perhaps the only real difficulty spikes being Watcher Knights and Hornet Sentinel. The thing about how Hollow Knight's world is designed is that it's really easy to get distracted and lost, which many players absolutely love. There is no better feeling than learning that the entire area you are in or the boss you just faced were optional. I've said it a million times, but the best reward a player can get is more game, and Hollow Knight is a leading example in this. Hearing that most boss fights will be optional gives me those same vibes, so hells yeah to that. We also got a deeper dive into how Mongoose Rodeo is going about designing and creating these boss fights. And while most of the stuff is worth a read on its own, the part I wanted to focus in on a bit more is, it's usually a good idea to design bosses in such a way that they are an amalgamation of the enemies seen in the respective area/biome. The player should already be familiar with the movesets based on the encounters they've seen to that point, and the boss fight should basically act like a sort of final test to consolidate everything they've learned so far. I agree with this to an extent. Designing a boss like this can really help tie up the lore or themes of an area, but the downside is this can get pretty predictable and stale fast. The boss that we used as an example in this update can easily make sense as the final boss of the underground crypt-like area with all of those long-nosed shovel guys. This boss looks awesome, and the moveset does seem like an expanded and collected version of all of the attacks of the little guys we've seen so far. And that's great. Remember how Soul Master was basically a combined version of the Soul Twisters and the Soul Warrior boss? When used sparingly, this is a great idea and helps with world building and subtly preparing the player. But if it's used too much, you can lose the element of surprise for players and eventually the difficulty as well. A huge part of combat-intensive games like these are those difficulty spikes, those boss fights that everyone remembers as the true test of a portion of the game. And the absolute best way to create a difficulty spike is for the fight to just come out of nowhere, making you ask, who the hell is this character? Why am I fighting them here? And why are they kicking my ass so hard? If every boss is built up around the theme of the enemies and areas, pretty soon you will fall into a loop of understanding the regular enemies to help you beat the boss. The flip side of this is that surprise fights can be more difficult if you always expect the themed boss. And look, obviously I don't expect Mongoose Rodeo to make every fight this way. This is just an extreme example of both types of designs. I'm sure Crowsworn will have its variability and difficulty spikes, although these might mostly be optional. It's just worth mentioning as a potential issue. There were a few other things of note in the recent updates, the biggest being the new upcoming demo for backers. We already got the boss battle demo, which was awesome, and this time around the demo will be made up of cut content to avoid spoiling too much of the main game, which I'm totally in love with. Cut content is always so cool to look through. We will also apparently get a demo to fight the Shovel Knight boss at some point as well, which is something I'm looking forward to. There was also some cool info on the general level design of Crowsworn, as well as some awesome particle effects showcasing, although I will leave the more specific details of this till a later time. As for the release date, Mongoose Rodeo has already stated the scope and quality of the game has risen greatly since the Kickstarter. Mix that with a much larger budget, way more backer promises to fulfill than they ever expected, COVID, and probably not wanting to crunch away like AAA devs, I'm sure, I would expect Crowsworn to release sometime in 2024, maybe even early 2025. That's totally fine. Devs should always take as much possible time as they can on a game of this scale. It's way better to get it right at launch instead of having to fix everything after. Besides, we have plenty of other amazing games to play until Crowsworn does come out, like Nine Souls, which is slated for this year. We also have Bow still in development, The Last Faith, Blasphemous 2, and yeah, I guess Silksong is possible to release in the next decade.